Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little unsettling. Not the kind of unsettling where your Wi-Fi cuts out mid-Netflix binge, but the medieval variety, where your freedom, reputation, and sometimes your life hinged on something called trial by ordeal. Forget about fair courts, lawyers in crisp suits, or judges banging gavels with solemn authority. In the Middle Ages, justice often meant one thing: God's judgment. And the way you proved your innocence wasn't by hiring the best attorney in town, but by surviving some of the most bizarre and terrifying tests imaginable. So before we dive into this grim world of boiling water, flaming irons, and rivers that determined your fate, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and let's step together into a time when guilt and innocence weren't argued in courtrooms, but left up to divine intervention. It's the year 1215. You're a peasant in a small English village, and your neighbor has just accused you of stealing a loaf of bread. Not a diamond, not gold coins, but a simple loaf. That's enough to put your entire future at risk. Because when there's no evidence, no witnesses, and nobody wants to listen to your excuses, the villagers turn to the church. The priest looks at you, looks at the crowd, and declares, God will decide. You've officially been sentenced to a trial by ordeal. Congratulations. You're now about to gamble your life on whether heaven itself intervenes to save you. The ordeal could take different forms. One of the most feared was the ordeal by boiling water. The priest would prepare a cauldron of water bubbling so violently you'd swear it wanted to eat you alive. A stone or ring was dropped to the bottom, and your task was simple, or rather horrifying. You had to plunge your bare hand into the scalding cauldron and pull the object out. If your hand healed cleanly in the following days, you were declared innocent. If it festered or blackened, you were guilty. Imagine standing there in front of your entire village, steam rising, your skin about to peel, and everyone watching, eager to see if you were chosen by God or abandoned. No pressure, right? Another favorite was the hot iron ordeal. You'd be handed a glowing piece of iron, straight from the fire, and told to carry it for several steps. If the burn healed quickly and cleanly, it meant God had protected you, and you were innocent. If the burn got worse, you were guilty. Keep in mind there was no aloe vera, no soothing cream, no clean bandages. Just raw, searing pain, followed by weeks of infection, and probably the permanent loss of whatever hand you happened to use. Your fate rested entirely on whether your wound healed in a way the priest and community found convincing. And priests, by the way, were often the ones checking your injuries. You might wonder, wasn't this system ripe for corruption? Absolutely. But in medieval society, where religion ruled every corner of life, no one dared to question it. Then there was the ordeal by water, perhaps the strangest of them all. Here's how it worked. You were tied up and tossed into a river or pond. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water of God supposedly rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, though there was a small problem. You were often tied up with rope or chains. So yes, congratulations, you prove your innocence, but you also drowned in the process. At least you went to heaven with a clean record. People genuinely believed this made sense. Imagine standing on the bank, bound at the wrists, and the last thing you see before being shoved into the water is a crowd of villagers cheering like they're watching a football match. That's how justice was served. It wasn't just common peasants who faced these ordeals. Nobles, too, were sometimes subjected to them. Though, as you might guess, the higher your status, the gentler your ordeal became. A nobleman accused of treason might not be thrown into a river, but instead have to swallow a chunk of dry bread and cheese. If he choked, he was guilty. If it slid down smoothly, he was innocent. That's right, your eternal fate could rest on whether your throat was a little dry that day. But here's where it gets interesting. By the early 13th century, even the church began to realize that this system was maybe, just maybe, not the most reliable way to determine justice. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council officially banned clergy from participating in ordeals. That should have been the end of it. But like many medieval traditions, it didn't just vanish overnight. Villages and lords kept the practice alive in one form or another, long after it was technically outlawed. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits involve dramatic public spectacles. Picture it from the crowd's perspective. On a dreary Sunday morning, when there wasn't much entertainment beyond watching chickens fight in the dirt, a trial by ordeal was like primetime television. Everyone gathered in the town square. There was tension, drama, fire, water, screaming. It had everything. The villagers got their entertainment. The church got to reinforce the fear of divine punishment. And the lord of the manor got to maintain order. Whether the accused lived or died was almost secondary. What mattered was that the community felt justice had been served, that God's hand had visibly chosen a side. Of course, not everyone was convinced. There are accounts of priests quietly rigging the ordeal to protect those they believed were innocent. For example, they might cool the water slightly before dipping or hand the accused an iron that wasn't quite as blazing hot as it appeared. These moments of mercy, however, were rare. For the most part, if you were accused, you prayed harder than you'd ever prayed before because your body was about to be put on the line in the most literal sense. Think for a moment what this says about medieval society. Justice wasn't about truth, evidence, or logic. It was about fear, spectacle, and unquestioning faith. People believed so strongly that God would intervene that they were willing to risk human lives to prove it. And when the system failed, when an innocent person burned, drowned, or choked, it was written off as God's mysterious will. It wasn't flawed humans at fault. It was divine justice, inscrutable and unquestionable. Now, let's play with the thought of you. Yes, you, waking up in this world. You're accused of stealing a chicken because your neighbor swore he saw feathers in your hut. You deny it, of course, but your word means nothing. Before you know it, you're standing barefoot in front of a boiling cauldron. The priest mutters Latin, the villagers cross themselves, and the pot bubbles like it's hungry for your flesh. Your hands are trembling, sweat pouring down your face, and everyone is staring. This isn't just about whether you stole chicken. This is about whether God himself will show mercy. You plunge your hand in, feel your skin blister instantly, and pull out the stone. The pain is indescribable. But now the waiting begins. For 3 days, your fate hangs on whether that burn heals or festers. Neighbors peek in to inspect your wound, whispering about whether it looks blessed or cursed. Can you imagine trying to sleep, knowing your entire future depends on how your skin scabs over? That was medieval justice. So next time you complain about a parking ticket or jury duty, remember, at least no one is asking you to grab a glowing hot iron or sink in a pond to prove your innocence. Trial by ordeal reminds us just how fragile fairness has been through history. And as bizarre and cruel as it sounds today, it was once accepted as the most righteous way to decide guilt or innocence. If trial by ordeal wasn't enough to terrify you, then let's talk about another medieval invention for keeping people in line, the ducking stool. On paper, it might sound almost comical, like something out of a carnival ride, but in practice, it was humiliating, freezing, and sometimes deadly. The ducking stool was mostly reserved for women accused of being scolds, which basically meant anyone who spoke too loudly, argued too much, or just annoyed the wrong man in the wrong town. It was also used for those suspected of witchcraft, gossiping, or nagging their husbands. In other words, if you had an opinion in medieval Europe and voiced it at the wrong time, congratulations. You might find yourself strapped to a chair about to be dunked repeatedly into icy water while your neighbors jeered. Imagine this. You live in a small village where everyone knows everyone's business. Privacy doesn't exist, and rumors spread faster than fleas on a dog. You argue with your husband about who gets to use the better wooden spoon at dinner, or you tell your neighbor that his pigs smell worse than usual. That's all it takes. The whispers start. She's a scold. She's mouthy. She doesn't know her place. By the time the village elders catch wind of it, the decision has already been made. You're going for a ride in the ducking stool. The device itself was simple but effective. A heavy wooden chair, sometimes with iron restraints, was attached to the end of a long beam. The beam pivoted on a frame like a giant seesaw. At the other end, men of the village would push down, lowering you into a pond or river, and then haul you back up again, sputtering, soaked, and shivering. over and over until they felt you'd been sufficiently punished. Think of it as the medieval version of waterboarding, except with a cheering audience and no safe word. The worst part wasn't just the cold water. It was the spectacle. These punishments were public events. Everyone came out to watch. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, vendors sold bread, and the accused woman became the entertainment of the day. People laughed as she struggled, gasped for air, and tried to keep from drowning. The ducking stool turned someone's misery into a festival. There was no dignity, no way to hide, no way to recover your reputation afterward. You'd be known forever as that woman who got ducked. Even if you survived, the stigma clung to you like the river water you'd coughed up. And yes, sometimes people died. Medieval rivers were filthy, full of sewage, animal carcasses, and disease. Being dunked in repeatedly wasn't just freezing, it was hazardous to your health. Pneumonia, infections, or even blunt trauma from being bashed against the side of the stool could kill you long after the punishment ended. But that was seen as part of the justice system. If you drowned, it must have been God's will. The same logic applied to ordeals. Survival meant innocence, and death meant guilt. Convenient, isn't it? Either way, the system justified itself. For women accused of witchcraft, the ducking stool was sometimes mixed with ordeal logic. The idea was that water, a pure element, would reject the guilty. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, though of course drowning meant innocence came far too late. The ducking stool blurred the line between punishment and test, humiliation and execution. It kept communities bound together by fear. Speak too much, step out of line, and this could be you. Think about how powerless you would feel. You're strapped into this chair, your wrists and ankles bound, a crowd roaring with laughter and insults. The beam creaks, your stomach drops, and suddenly your face slams into freezing water. You can't breathe. You thrash, bubbles roaring in your ears, and just as you think you're about to die, you're hauled up into the air. The crowd cheers. You cough, spit, choke, water running from your nose, only for the stool to tilt again, plunging you back under. The cycle repeats until you're numb, broken, and shamed beyond repair. That's medieval justice for a nagging tongue. It's worth pausing to realize how gendered this punishment was. Men weren't usually strapped into ducking stools. This was a tool of control, a way to silence women who stepped outside the narrow roles medieval society demanded. If you were too loud, too opinionated, too independent, or simply unlucky, you risked public humiliation. The ducking stool wasn't just about punishment, it was about making an example. Every woman in the audience learned the lesson. Stay quiet, stay obedient, or this could happen to you. The stool also became a civic symbol. Some towns proudly displayed their ducking stool year-round, perched by the water as a reminder of the justice that awaited anyone foolish enough to misbehave. Records show some villages even engraved moral slogans on the beams, little warnings carved into the wood. Imagine walking past that every day, reminded of the fate that awaited you if you dared to cross the wrong person. In some cases, the ducking stool was portable. Officials would wheel it through town with the accused strapped in, parading them around before the dunking began. That way, even those who didn't live near the river could enjoy the show. The humiliation started before the water ever touched your skin. People hurled insults, rotten vegetables, and worse. By the time you reached the pond, you were already broken down. The dunking itself was just the final act of the performance. Over time, as Europe slowly inched toward more modern forms of justice, the ducking stool fell out of fashion. But echoes of it lasted well into the 17th and even 18th centuries in some places. Colonial America even had its share. Towns like Virginia and Massachusetts used ducking stools to punish disorderly women. The Puritans, famous for their strict moral codes, saw it as a fitting way to maintain control. So if you thought this punishment was just a medieval relic, think again. The echoes of medieval justice lingered for centuries. Now, picture yourself back in that world. You're accused not of theft, not of violence, but of scolding, A crime so vague it can mean anything from disagreeing with your husband to gossiping about the mayor's new boots. Before you can even defend yourself, you're tied down in a heavy wooden chair. The entire town gathers, eager to watch. The sun beats down, the water below ripples dark and cold. You feel the stool shift. Your heart pounds. Then splash. You're gone beneath the surface. Your lungs scream for air as you fight against the ropes holding you in place. When you're yanked back up, gasping, the crowd roars like they've just witnessed a play. You can barely see through the water dripping into your eyes, but already the beam is lowering again. Down you go, again and again, until you're no longer sure if you'll come back up. That was the ducking stool. Equal parts punishment, entertainment, and social warning. It's chilling to think that such a crude, cruel device could pass for justice. But in a world where the law was more about keeping order than protecting rights, it made sense to those who lived it. Pain and humiliation were tools, and the ducking stool was one of the sharpest. The next time someone calls medieval punishments bizarre, remember this chair by the river, waiting for its next victim. It wasn't just bizarre. It was terrifyingly effective at keeping people silent. If the ducking stool wasn't enough to silence someone, there was always something far worse waiting in the shadows. The scold's bridle, also called the Brank's bridle. This device didn't dunk you in freezing water. It strapped humiliation and pain directly onto your face. Imagine an iron cage fitted tightly over your head, with sharp metal pieces pressing into your mouth and tongue. It was designed for one thing and one thing only, to keep you quiet. In a world where women could be punished simply for speaking too much, the bridle was the ultimate gag. The contraption looked like something out of a horror movie. Iron strips formed a cage that enclosed the head, often with a padlock at the back so you couldn't wriggle free. Attached to the inside was a spike plate or bit, which pressed down on your tongue. Some versions had jagged edges or even a long prong that pushed into the throat, making swallowing nearly impossible. The message was clear. Your words have consequences, and now you won't be speaking at all. Being forced to wear one wasn't done in secret. Just like the ducking stool, this was public humiliation, a punishment as much about spectacle as it was about silencing. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, the heavy iron digging into their skin, the spikes grinding against their tongue. Imagine trying to walk with an iron muzzle weighing down your head, drool spilling uncontrollably, unable to speak, unable even to swallow without stabbing pain. And all the while, neighbors jeered, laughed, and threw insults. The bridle turned a human being into an object, a living warning sign for everyone watching. The reasons for being bridled were depressingly vague. Being a scold could mean anything. Gossiping too much, criticizing your husband, arguing with neighbors, or just being deemed disrespectful. Men in authority, husbands, magistrates, priests could recommend it, and local officials could enforce it. In some cases, women accused of witchcraft were forced to wear the bridle during interrogation, supposedly to prevent them from cursing their questioners. So, not only were you gagged, you were also branded as someone dangerous and evil, whether you had done anything at all. The physical torment was only part of the cruelty. The psychological damage may have been worse. Imagine being marched through your own village, every familiar face staring at you, laughing as you stumble, humiliated beyond belief. You can't defend yourself, can't protest your innocence, can't speak at all. The iron cage makes you look less than human, a grotesque parody of yourself. And when you're finally released, if you're lucky enough not to die of infection or strangulation, you're left with scars, both visible and invisible. Everyone remembers you as the one who wore the bridle. Your reputation, your dignity, your voice, all gone. There are accounts of bridles being used not only on women, but occasionally on men who spoke out against authority. One record tells of a preacher who criticized officials too harshly and found himself locked in the same gag he'd once approved for others. But make no mistake, the overwhelming majority of victims were women. The bridle was a weapon of patriarchy, a tool to enforce silence and submission in a society terrified of female voices. Some versions of the bridle came with even more humiliating additions. A bell might be attached to the top, so that every step you took rang out across the streets, announcing your shame like a perverse parade. Chains could be fixed to the muzzle, allowing guards to drag you through town like an animal. In Scotland, some bridles had grotesque designs, carved with devilish faces to make the wearer appear monstrous. Punishment, humiliation, and dehumanization blended together into one iron nightmare. Picture the scene. It's a chilly morning, and the townsfolk are gathering in the square. You're dragged forward, struggling, your hands bound. The executioner, because yes, that was often his job too, brings out the bridle. It gleams with a cruel shine in the pale light. You feel your heart pound as the iron cage is lowered onto your head. The weight is suffocating. Then comes the bit, the jagged iron shoved against your tongue. The pain is instant, sharp, nauseating. You try to cry out, but the sound is muffled into pathetic groans. The crowd laughs. Children point. Someone throws a rotten apple. The bell above your head jingles with each miserable step as you're marched through the streets like livestock. You can't speak. You can't even spit out the metal pressing into your throat. All you can do is endure while your community drinks in your suffering like it's theater. The scold's bridle wasn't just a punishment. It was a spectacle of power. It reminded everyone, especially women, that speech was dangerous, that obedience was expected, and that society could literally steal your voice if you stepped out of line. In some towns, the bridles were hung on public display when not in use, like trophies, rusting reminders of what awaited anyone foolish enough to cross authority. Imagine walking past that every day, the cold iron glinting at you, whispering a silent threat. And while the bridle was most common in England and Scotland, its influence stretched further. Variations appeared in Germany, in parts of Scandinavia, even carried over to colonial America. For centuries, silence could be forced upon you with a locked cage of iron. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that such punishments finally faded, condemned as barbaric even by societies still filled with cruelty of their own. But think for a moment about how effective it must have been. If you were a woman in a medieval village and saw your neighbor gagged and paraded through town, you learned your lesson instantly. Better to keep your thoughts to yourself than risk the cage. Better to stay silent, even when wronged, even when your husband beat you or your lord cheated you. The bridle didn't just punish the individual, it cowed the entire community. And yet, the echoes of it linger even now. The idea that some people should be silenced, that certain voices are too disruptive, too uncomfortable, too inconvenient. Those ideas didn't vanish with the bridle. They just changed form. Today, thankfully, no one straps iron cages on our heads for speaking out. But the fear of humiliation, the social punishment for saying the wrong thing, still haunts us. That's what makes the scold's bridle so chilling. It wasn't just a physical torture device. It was a symbol, a message carved in iron. Silence can be forced, voices can be stolen. So imagine yourself again in that world, waking up one morning to find that your neighbor has accused you of gossiping about her pigs. Maybe you said one careless thing. Maybe you said nothing at all. But the men in charge decide it's enough. You're dragged into the square. The bridle waits. You beg, you cry, but no one listens. The iron cage comes down, the spike digs into your tongue, and suddenly you have no words left. You're marched through the streets while the bell jingles above your head. The crowd roars with laughter, but all you hear is the crushing silence forced inside your mouth. That was the scold's bridle, one of the cruelest reminders that in the medieval world, even your own tongue didn't belong to you. And if you thought being gagged in iron was humiliating, medieval authorities had another punishment waiting that was less about pain and more about pure ridicule: the drunkard's cloak. It didn't break bones or draw blood, but it stripped away dignity in a way that lingered long after the punishment ended. The drunkard's cloak was basically a giant wooden barrel with holes cut for the arms and head. Imagine being forced to wear a keg like it's your new outfit of the day, stumbling down the street while the entire village points and laughs. That was the fate of anyone caught drunk in public one too many times. The cloak wasn't about justice in the sense of righting a wrong. It was about shame. In a world where taverns were packed, Ale was safer to drink than water, and drunkenness was common. The authorities couldn't stop people from drinking, but they could make sure no one wanted to get caught drunk twice. Strap someone into a barrel and parade them around the market square, and suddenly everyone gets the message. Overindulge, and you'll end up the town's walking keg. Picture it. A man staggering out of the alehouse after one too many mugs. His speech slurs, his legs wobble, and his neighbors shake their heads. Before he can even collapse into a ditch, the town watch grabs him. Instead of throwing him in a cell, they haul out the barrel. The cooper, the local barrel maker, had already prepared one for just this occasion. They shove the drunkard's arms through two rough-cut holes, jam his head through another, and tighten the straps. Now he's half man, half barrel, a miserable sight. The wood digs into his shoulders, splinters scrape his skin, and the weight makes walking almost impossible. But walk he must. Guards shove him forward, and the parade begins. Children laugh, dogs bark, vendors jeer. The punishment turns into street theater. Some towns made the condemned march for hours, clunking along in their wooden prison until their legs gave out. Others forced them to stand in the town square all day, baking in the sun, sweating inside the stinking barrel while passers-by spat insults. Every step was agony, but the worst pain wasn't physical. It was knowing you had become the joke of the entire community. The drunkard's cloak wasn't limited to men either. Records show women were sometimes strapped in, though it was rarer. And it wasn't always just for drunkenness. The punishment was flexible, used for petty crimes like brawling, gossiping, or even being generally disruptive. If the town wanted to shame you, the barrel was ready. It symbolized foolishness, excess, and lack of self-control. It made the guilty into a walking metaphor, a vessel filled with shame, sloshing about for all to see. Now, imagine trying to move in one. A barrel isn't light, especially not the large ones used to store ale. The straps dig into your flesh, the weight pulls at your neck, and every stumble sends the rim smashing into your knees. Breathing inside the narrow confines is hot and suffocating, your sweat soaking the wood. And all the while, strangers laugh like you're part of a comedy show. You're not even treated as dangerous. You're treated as ridiculous, a clown forced to play your part in the cruelest theater of all, public shame. This punishment had a psychological sting sharper than many whips. Pain fades, but humiliation lingers. When the barrel finally comes off, you're left standing in the same clothes you wore into the tavern, but now you're marked. Everyone saw you. Everyone remembers you. Tomorrow, when you walk to the market, people nudge each other and whisper, "There goes the barrel man." Employers might hesitate to hire you. Neighbors might mock you. Even your family carries the shame by association. The cloak didn't just punish the crime of drunkenness. It branded the person with a permanent reputation. What's even darker is that people loved it. Public punishments thrived on entertainment value, and the drunkard's cloak was crowd-pleasing humiliation at its finest. Town records and illustrations show spectators laughing, pointing, clapping as the condemned shuffled along. It was theater, moral lesson, and comedy rolled into one. The barrel made the sinner look ridiculous, their dignity stripped away until they resembled a character in a grotesque carnival. The crowd didn't just watch. They participated, hurling insults, rotten vegetables, sometimes even stones. It turned one person's misery into a shared community event. And while the drunkard's cloak is mostly associated with medieval and early modern Europe, echoes of it appear in other places. In Spain, Italy, and parts of Germany, similar punishments were used, sometimes with different names, but always the same idea: turn the offender into a living object of ridicule. Even across the Atlantic, early American colonies adopted variations. It turns out public shame was a universal language. Now, think of yourself being forced into one. You wake up after a heavy night of drinking, head pounding, stomach churning, only to find yourself grabbed by the local watch. Before you can protest, they shove you into the barrel. Your arms strain against the holes. Your head feels like it's trapped in a vise, and your body is crushed under the weight. You stagger, trying to walk, but each step makes you wobble, and the crowd bursts out laughing. You hear children calling you names. feel food scraps hitting your shoulders. You want to disappear, but there's no escape. The barrel clings to you like your own coffin, only upright and inescapable. By the end, you're soaked in sweat, your back aches, and your spirit is broken. The punishment has done its job. You vow never to touch ale again, or at least never to get caught drunk again. That's how the cloak worked. It didn't need to draw blood to be effective. It relied on humiliation. In a society where reputation was everything, shame could be a heavier punishment than chains or whips. It's strange, isn't it? Today, drunkenness is often laughed off, shrugged at, or punished with a fine. But in the medieval world, it was a moral failing, a sin against both God and community. The drunkard's cloak made sure you never forgot it. One night of foolishness could haunt you for years. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The drunkard's cloak wasn't about fairness or reform. It was about control, about making an example. It showed the community that order would be maintained, that sin would be mocked into submission. And it did so in a way that stuck in memory, burned into the mind of both the punished and the onlookers. The next time someone stumbled out of the tavern, they didn't just think of their hangover. They thought of the barrel waiting by the square, ready to swallow them whole. So imagine walking through your town in that time, and you hear the clunk, clunk, clunk of wood on cobblestones. You turn and see a man stumbling forward, arms jutting out of a barrel, sweat streaming down his face. The crowd jeers, a bell tolls in the distance, and the message is clear. Step out of line, and you too could become a barrel on legs, the butt of every joke in town. That was the drunkard's cloak, a punishment as ridiculous as it was devastating. And if humiliation in a barrel seemed like the worst fate imaginable, the medieval imagination still had cruelties far darker, cruelties that didn't just seek to embarrass you, but to destroy your body piece by piece while the crowd watched. Enter the Catherine wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, one of the most feared execution devices in all of Europe. Unlike the ducking stool or the drunkard's cloak, this wasn't about shame or reform. This was about terror, about showing everyone what happened when you committed crimes so serious that the authorities wanted not just your death, but your utter obliteration. The wheel was a simple device, yet its horror lay in its simplicity. It was a massive wooden cartwheel, the kind you'd see rolling across muddy roads or creaking beneath wagons of hay. But this wheel had a much bloodier purpose. When a person was sentenced to death by the wheel, they were tied down flat, arms and legs spread wide, often placed on a raised scaffold so everyone could see. Then came the executioner with an iron bar or hammer. One by one, he would smash the bones of the condemned, legs first, then arms, sometimes even the spine, deliberately shattering each limb while avoiding vital organs so the victim stayed alive as long as possible. Imagine the sound, the sickening crack of bone, the screams of agony that pierced the air, the dull thud of iron against flesh and wood. The crowd would gasp, some turning away, others leaning in closer. This wasn't quick or merciful. It was slow, deliberate, a performance of suffering meant to sear itself into memory. Once the bones were shattered, the executioner would weave the broken limbs through the spokes of the wheel, twisting and threading the body until it looked less human and more like a grotesque spider crushed against the wood. Then the wheel itself was hoisted upright or nailed to a pole, leaving the victim exposed to the sun, birds, and flies. Sometimes death came in hours, sometimes days. The wheel was used across much of Europe for centuries, particularly for crimes seen as especially heinous: murder, robbery with violence, treason. It was designed not just to kill, but to annihilate, to strip away humanity and turn the criminal into a warning, a spectacle, a grotesque billboard for law and order. The message was simple: this is what happens to those who defy authority. And because the body was often left on display long after death, the punishment extended beyond the grave. Your remains became part of the landscape, a grisly reminder to every passerby of justice served. But it wasn't only about the physical torment. The Catherine wheel carried with it a heavy, symbolic weight. Wheels were tools of labor, symbols of movement and progress. To be broken upon one was to be ground down by society itself. reduced to nothing but shattered pieces in the machinery of order. Even the name, Catherine Wheel, is layered with irony. It comes from Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a Christian martyr who, according to legend, was sentenced to be executed on a spiked wheel. But the wheel broke apart when she touched it, sparing her body. The punishment meant to destroy her, instead, became a symbol of divine intervention. Yet centuries later, her name was attached to one of the cruelest execution methods mankind ever devised. Now put yourself there. You've been convicted of robbery, accused of murdering a merchant on the road. Whether you actually did it or not hardly matters. Your guilt is assumed, your fate sealed. The crowd gathers in the town square, their breath clouding in the cold morning air. You're dragged forward, bound in ropes, your heart pounding so hard you can barely hear the priest muttering his final blessing. Then you see it, the wheel. Huge, looming, waiting. The executioner raises his iron bar, and the first blow falls. Your leg explodes with pain, bones splintering, the crowd gasping at the sound. You scream, but the second blow lands before the first agony has even dimmed. Each strike takes another part of you, until your body is a mangled ruin. And then, as if that weren't enough, your shattered limbs are threaded into the wheel's wooden spokes, stretched and twisted until you hardly recognize yourself. They raise the wheel high, and the birds are already circling. You can still hear the crowd. Some pity you, some cheer, some just watch in silence. You hang there, broken, waiting for the end. What's perhaps most disturbing is that this wasn't considered cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was law. It was order. The breaking wheel was codified into the justice systems of many kingdoms. In France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, it was the go-to punishment for serious crimes. Sometimes there were variations. In certain cases, executioners were instructed to strike fatal blows first, killing the condemned before weaving their corpse into the wheel. That was considered mercy, but often the goal was the opposite: to keep the victim alive for as long as possible, suffering publicly as an example to others. And the public did watch. Executions were community events, almost festivals. Vendors sold food and drink. Children clung to their parents. Travelers stopped to witness the show. The wheel was brutal, but it was also entertainment. People wanted to see justice not just done, but displayed in the most dramatic fashion possible. A hanging was too quick, too ordinary. The wheel gave them a spectacle, a theater of agony that they could talk about for weeks. Even after death, the wheel's cruelty lingered. The body left on display became food for crows and wolves, bones bleaching in the sun, fragments falling to the ground. Travelers might pass by months later and still see the grisly remains dangling from the spokes. In some places, wheels full of bones stood at crossroads, warning all who passed of the consequences of crime. The dead became part of the living landscape, a macabre signpost pointing the way toward obedience. And yet, in a strange way, there was also a grim honor to being broken on the wheel. Criminals feared it, yes, but some embraced the spectacle, using their final moments to curse their accusers, defy the authorities, or proclaim their innocence. There are accounts of condemned men singing psalms or shouting insults at the crowd while their bones were being smashed, as if to prove that even the wheel couldn't break their spirit. These stories lived on, becoming part of local folklore, transforming executions into legends. But for the vast majority, the wheel was simply terror. The thought of it was enough to keep people in line. Parents warned their children, lords warned their subjects, and the wheel itself, sitting silently in the town square when not in use, reminded everyone what awaited the disobedient. It was more than just a punishment. It was a symbol of control, a weapon of fear wielded as much in the imagination as in reality. So picture the sound of the wheel creaking in the wind, the faint rattle of bones woven into its spokes. A lonely bird perches on top, picking at what little flesh remains. Travelers glance nervously and hurry on. In a village nearby, no one speaks of rebellion. No one dares question authority. The wheel is always watching, always waiting, a grim reminder that in the medieval world, justice wasn't about fairness. It was about fear, pain, and power. That was the Catherine wheel. Not just execution, but obliteration. Not just death, but a warning carved into the very landscape. A punishment so brutal it turned human beings into twisted relics of terror, left to rot in the open air until nothing was left but memory and bone. And as if being shattered across a wheel wasn't enough, medieval justice had yet another horror waiting in its arsenal. One so grotesque that even describing it makes you wince. Sawing in half. This wasn't just punishment. It was the kind of spectacle designed to etch itself permanently into the minds of everyone who saw it. Unlike the wheel, which slowly broke you apart from the outside, sawing in half worked from the inside out, literally dividing the body as the crowd leaned forward to watch. If the wheel was a performance of bones, the saw was a performance of flesh. The method varied depending on region, but the general idea was horrifyingly simple. The condemned was suspended upside down, often by the ankles, sometimes with hands tied behind their back. Why upside down? Because it kept the victim alive longer. Blood flowed toward the brain, keeping them conscious even as the saw bit into their flesh. Executioners would start at the groin, the most sensitive and excruciating place imaginable, and slowly work downward through the pelvis, hips, and into the torso. In some accounts, the sawing continued all the way to the chest. Others suggest it often stopped once the victim was unconscious or dead. Either way, the process could take hours, each grinding stroke of the saw echoing through the square as the crowd gasped, gagged, or cheered. It's almost unbearable to picture. The first cuts tearing through skin and muscle, the smell of blood filling the air, the shrieks of agony muffled only by exhaustion. The executioners didn't rush. They worked methodically, deliberately, dragging the saw back and forth, while the victim writhed helplessly above them. With each stroke, the body opened wider, splitting apart like firewood beneath an axe. But this was no clean chop. It was slow, ragged, a performance of suffering stretched as long as possible. Now, imagine yourself there, one of the villagers packed into the square. Maybe you came because everyone else came, because in a town with no theater, no fairs, no cinema, this was the entertainment. You push your way forward and see the condemned hanging upside down, his face red from the rush of blood, his eyes wide with terror. Then the saw touches skin, and the first scream tears through the crowd. Some people cover their ears, others lean closer. A child bursts into tears, clinging to their mother's dress. But the execution continues. Every pull of the blade feels like a lifetime, and yet it goes on and on. By the time silence finally falls, the image is burned into your mind forever. That was the point. Sawing in half was most often reserved for crimes considered especially heinous: treason, blasphemy, witchcraft, or murder. It wasn't a common punishment. It was too theatrical, too extreme, but when it was used, it was unforgettable. Some accounts link it to parts of medieval Europe, especially in Germany, France, and Eastern Europe. Others suggest it was used in the Middle East and Asia as well, with different cultural twists. Wherever it appeared, the idea was the same: to make the body itself into a warning, to carve justice quite literally into flesh. Suspending the victim upside down also had another grim, symbolic weight. It inverted the natural order, making the condemned less than human, a creature stripped of dignity. Hanging them like livestock, like a carcass in a butcher's shop, reinforced the message that they were no longer part of the community. They were meat, an offering to justice. Even the act of cutting downward, from groin to chest, carried symbolic humiliation. It destroyed not just the body, but the seat of sexuality, fertility, and identity, turning the punishment into a kind of ritualized erasure. Some chroniclers describe how executioners sometimes paused midway, letting the victim dangle while the crowd drank in the spectacle. Others claim saws were deliberately kept dull to prolong the suffering, each stroke more of a tear than a cut. Whether these details were fact or exaggeration, the point remains: this was not about swift justice. It was about pain, fear, and the spectacle of absolute control. Now, put yourself not in the crowd this time, but in the place of the condemned. You're accused of treason against your lord, maybe plotting with a rival king, maybe just caught saying the wrong thing in the wrong place. You protest your innocence, but it doesn't matter. The decision is made. You're dragged into square, bound, beaten, stripped. The executioners tie your ankles, hoist you upside down, and the blood rushes to your head. Your chest heaves as panic sets in. You watch the crowd turn into a blur of faces, upside-down smiles, wide eyes staring. Then you feel the saw touch your skin. The first bite makes you shriek, the pain exploding like fire. But the saw doesn't stop. Back and forth it goes, deeper and deeper, until screaming becomes impossible, until sound itself is drowned out by agony. You're still alive, still aware, but your body is no longer your own. By the time the world finally fades, you are nothing but spectacle, your body split open for all to see. It's tempting to think of this as too extreme, too theatrical to have really happened. And yes, historians debate how often sawing was actually used. Some suggest it was rare, more legend than reality, exaggerated in stories to frighten people. But the fact that it was ever considered, that it appears in records and chronicles, tells us everything about the medieval mindset. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't about protecting rights. It was about power, fear, and performance. And sawing embodied all three in the most grotesque way imaginable. Even if it wasn't common, the image of sawing lived in the imagination of the people. Tales spread from town to town, stories whispered by candlelight of the man who was sawn in half for his crimes. His body split like timber while the crowd screamed. Whether or not it happened in your village, you believed it could, and that was enough to keep people in line. The myth of sawing was as powerful as the act itself. Think, too, about how this punishment lingers in memory, even now. The phrase sawn in half conjures magic tricks and stage illusions today, but its roots lie in real terror. The difference between a magician's smiling assistant and a medieval executioner's victim is the difference between theater and nightmare. In one, the audience claps. In the other, they whisper prayers and try not to vomit. So the next time you picture medieval justice, don't just think of swords and gallows. Think of the saw grinding slowly through flesh, turning a human being into a grotesque lesson carved in wood and bone. That was sawing in half. Not just execution, but mutilation as theater. A punishment so cruel it may have blurred the line between reality and legend, but real enough that people feared it, remembered it, and passed it on in whispers through the centuries. And if being split open with a saw wasn't enough to haunt the imagination, the Middle Ages also gave us one of the most infamous torture devices ever whispered about, the Iron Maiden. Now, whether it truly existed in medieval times or was later exaggerated is still debated by historians. Some claim it was more legend than reality, a Victorian invention meant to paint the past as barbaric. But in the minds of people then and later, the Iron Maiden stood as a terrifying symbol of cold, mechanical cruelty, a coffin of spikes designed to embrace you in death. The device itself was a tall, human-shaped cabinet made of wood or iron, often resembling a sarcophagus or shrine. It stood upright with two doors that opened outward, and inside, lining every surface, were spikes. Not long spears, but narrow, carefully placed iron prongs positioned so that when the door shut, they pierced flesh without striking instantly fatal organs. The victim wouldn't die right away. They would be punctured, bleeding slowly, unable to move as the metal cage closed around them. Trapped in total darkness, they would suffocate, bleed, and starve in silence, their body pressed by cold iron until life finally slipped away. Imagine standing before such a contraption. The executioner swings the doors open with a groan of metal, revealing a hollow figure, shaped like a human but empty, hungry. The spikes gleam faintly in the light of torches, some crusted with rust, others sharp and fresh. You see where they're positioned, one at the stomach, one at the thigh, one just grazing where your eye might be. They weren't meant to kill quickly. They were meant to torture delicately. Enough to puncture, to pierce, to make every breath agony, but not enough to let you die swiftly. And then, as the crowd holds its breath, you're pushed forward. The doors swing shut. The sound of iron slamming home echoes like a final heartbeat. Inside, you're engulfed by blackness. You try to move, but every twitch drives a spike deeper. Blood trickles down your skin, warm and sticky, but you can't wipe it away. You can barely breathe, chest compressed by the unyielding metal, lungs filling with shallow, ragged gasps. Time stretches into eternity. Minutes feel like hours, hours like days. The darkness is absolute. Your world reduced to pain, pressure, and the faint drip of your own blood. That was the horror of the Iron Maiden. Not just pain, but suffocating isolation, a slow death hidden behind steel walls. The psychological terror was as powerful as the physical. Even if the device wasn't used often, the threat of it was enough. Just the sight of the thing, looming tall and hollow, was enough to make the strongest prisoner tremble. It was theater again, the medieval specialty, an object that turned justice into spectacle. Towns displayed their Iron Maidens publicly, as if to say, step out of line, and this is what awaits you. In some cases, the figures were decorated to resemble saints or holy statues, turning the punishment into a twisted parody of religion. An embrace of faith turned into an embrace of death. But here's the twist. Historians argue that the Iron Maiden might not have actually been used in the Middle Ages at all. The earliest solid references to it appear centuries later, in the 16th and 17th centuries, when chroniclers wrote lurid stories about medieval cruelty. Some even believe museums in the 19th century built Iron Maidens out of older artifacts to shock visitors and reinforce the idea that the past was a savage, blood-soaked age compared to their supposedly enlightened times. In other words, the Iron Maiden may have been less a medieval reality and more a medieval myth constructed after the fact. Still, whether it was used or not, the fact that people believed it could exist speaks volumes. The human mind imagined this coffin of spikes, imagined being shut inside it, imagined the slow, crushing, bleeding death, and it terrified them. It became a symbol of medieval justice at its most merciless, a byword for cruelty, whether or not it was ever really wielded. Sometimes myths are just as powerful as reality. There are, however, grim records of similar devices. Spiked chairs, cages with pointed interiors, even barrels filled with nails appear in various punishments across Europe. So even if the Iron Maiden, as we picture it, the full sarcophagus of spikes, was rare or mythical, the idea of using sharp iron to prolong agony was very real. People were creative with cruelty. They didn't need an Iron Maiden to torture someone. They had dozens of other tools for the job. Now think again of yourself in that world. You've been accused of heresy, of speaking against the church. You're dragged before the Iron Maiden. The crowd hushed, your heart hammering. The doors creak open, the spikes gleaming in the torchlight. You cry out, plead your innocence, but no one listens. Hands shove you forward. Cold iron presses against your back, the first spike digging into your shoulder. Then, with a final shove, the doors close. Darkness, pressure, the sting of a dozen punctures. You try to scream, but your chest can barely expand. Each shallow breath scrapes your lungs against iron. Days stretch into nights, time warps. You don't even know when you finally die, because death comes so slowly it feels like it was always there. The Iron Maiden, real or not, became a story that defined the cruelty of the medieval imagination. It was the perfect punishment to whisper about around a fire, the ultimate warning to keep children obedient, the horrifying centerpiece of chronicles meant to make readers gasp. Whether any prisoner actually died inside its spiked embrace almost doesn't matter. The fear it inspired was real, and fear is as much a tool of power as iron or fire. Even now, the Iron Maiden lives in our imagination. It appears in horror films, novels, even heavy metal albums. The very name conjures dread. A coffin, a prison, a tomb you enter alive and never leave. It is the stuff of nightmares, whether born in truth or myth. So when we talk about bizarre medieval punishments, we can't leave it out. The Iron Maiden may not have been hammered together by medieval blacksmiths in quite the way legend says, but it has become one of the most enduring symbols of that era's cruelty. A device that embodies the dark side of human creativity. Not just killing, but killing slowly, theatrically, and with an almost artistic flourish of horror. That was the Iron Maiden. Not just a punishment, not just a myth, but a story so terrifying it became truth in the minds of all who heard it. And as strange as the Iron Maiden sounded, the Middle Ages weren't done surprising us. Because not all punishments were reserved for people. Believe it or not, animals sometimes stood trial too. Yes, actual animals. Pigs, goats, dogs, even roosters were dragged before courts, accused of crimes, and sentenced like humans. It sounds absurd now, but to a medieval villager, it made perfect sense. If justice was supposed to be universal, if sin corrupted all of creation, then even beasts could be guilty. And so they were tried, convicted, and punished, sometimes with the same gravity as a human criminal. The most common culprits were pigs. Pigs roamed freely through villages, scrounging for scraps, often mingling with children in muddy streets. And pigs are opportunistic. Leave a baby unattended, and a pig might do the unthinkable. Records describe horrifying cases where pigs attacked infants. And when that happened, the village wanted blood. The pig was captured, chained, and put on trial for murder. Witnesses were called. The local judge presided. Sometimes the pig was even dressed in human clothes to emphasize the parody of justice. Then, when the sentence was read, the pig would be executed, hanged, burned, or even buried alive. Imagine the spectacle. A huge sow trussed up in rags, squealing as she's dragged into the square. The villagers glaring as though she understands every word of the accusation. A clerk reads aloud the charges in solemn Latin. This pig, having maliciously and willfully slain an innocent child, the crowd murmurs. The judge nods gravely. The sentence is death. And then, unbelievably, the punishment is carried out in full, as though the pig were a human criminal. To us it sounds absurd, but to them it was necessary. If justice ignored the pig, what would that say about divine order? It wasn't only pigs. Dogs, too, could be executed if they attacked people. Roosters were put on trial for laying eggs. Yes, you heard that right, because an egg laid by a rooster was believed to be the spawn of the devil, capable of hatching a cockatrice, a monstrous serpent. In 1474, in Basel, Switzerland, a rooster was tried, convicted, and burned alive for this very crime. Imagine standing in a medieval courtroom, watching a solemn judge sentence a confused chicken to death for the crime of laying an egg. People cheered, satisfied that evil had been purged. And it didn't stop with farm animals. There are records of locusts and rats being put on trial. How do you punish locusts? With excommunication, apparently. Priests would hold ceremonies, threatening swarms of insects with curses if they didn't leave the fields. Sometimes frogs were warned to quit croaking in churchyards or risk divine wrath. The very idea of dragging pests into a courtroom shows how deeply medieval people believed justice governed all parts of the world, not just human society. If God's law was cosmic, then everything from men to mice had to answer to it. Picture being a villager in one of these trials. You gather in the town hall, curious, maybe excited. The accused is brought forward, not a man, not a woman, but a goat tethered with rope, chewing on hay. The prosecutor speaks with full seriousness, outlining the animal's crimes, citing testimony from witnesses who swear the goat gored their neighbor's child. The defense, yes, sometimes animals were given lawyers, tries to argue that the goat was provoked or that the crime couldn't be proven. But it hardly matters. The judge pounds the table. The goat is guilty. The sentence, hanging. And sure enough, the next day, the animal swings from a gallows. The crowd watches solemnly, believing order has been restored. It's easy to laugh at this now, to shake our heads at how ridiculous it seems. But there was logic to it in their minds. The medieval world was deeply symbolic. Every act had cosmic meaning. If an animal committed violence and nothing was done, then the community might feel cursed, exposed to divine punishment. By holding a trial, they reinforced the idea that the moral order was intact, that every being, human or animal, was under God's eye. It was less about punishing the pig and more about reassuring the people. And yet, sometimes, these trials reveal flashes of compassion. In some records, animals were acquitted if there wasn't enough evidence. Other times, an entire swarm of rats might be given weeks to leave a field before being condemned. The absurdity hides something serious, a medieval obsession with fairness, even when it made no sense. They extended the rituals of justice to creatures incapable of understanding them, because they couldn't imagine a world where crime went unpunished. Still, the punishments could be brutal. Animals were executed in the same ways humans were. Hanged from gallows, burned at the stake, even mutilated before death. Some pigs accused of infanticide were dressed in human clothes, paraded through the streets, and then hanged in full view of the crowd. The symbolism was clear. They were criminals, and they would be treated as such. The public watched, nodded, and felt justice was served. Now picture yourself walking through your village, and you hear the sound of drums. You hurry to the square, expecting another thief or murderer on trial. But no, today it's a pig, squealing and bucking as men struggle to drag it forward. The judge reads the charges. People nod seriously, as though the pig can understand every word. Then the sentence comes: hanging. The pig is hoisted by its hind legs, struggling, choking, until it falls limp. The crowd disperses satisfied, and you're left thinking, not that the trial was strange, but that order has been preserved. That's how natural it felt to them. Animal punishments didn't vanish quickly either. They lasted into the early modern period, with records stretching as late as the 18th century. The more rational age of enlightenment eventually ridiculed them out of practice, but the echoes lingered in folklore and stories. They remind us how differently the medieval mind worked, how symbolic, how ritualistic, how obsessed with keeping cosmic balance. To them, pigs and chickens weren't just animals. They were potential agents of chaos, capable of disrupting the fragile order of village life. And if you didn't punish them, who knew what might happen? It's easy to dismiss these trials as bizarre relics of superstition. But look closer, and they reveal the heart of medieval justice. It wasn't about facts and evidence as we know them. It was about ritual, about community, about reassuring people that the world was ordered and just. Even if it meant hauling a rooster into court for the crime of laying an egg, the ritual itself mattered. The punishment was theater, the trial was a performance, and the meaning was what counted. So when we think of medieval punishments, don't just picture iron cages, wheels, or saws. Picture a pig on trial, a rooster at the stake, rats being excommunicated by a bishop. Picture a world where justice was so universal, so all-encompassing, that even animals had to answer for their sins. That was the strange, surreal reality of animal punishments, a system as symbolic as it was brutal, as absurd as it was deadly. And if putting pigs on trial sounded strange enough, medieval justice still had punishments so cruel and theatrical that they seemed designed not just to kill, but to horrify everyone who witnessed them. Few were as dreaded or as stomach-turning as execution by boiling. Unlike the wheel or the saw, this one didn't rely on breaking bones or slicing flesh. It relied on the slow, relentless agony of heat, the body cooking alive in front of an audience that could hear, smell, and even taste the punishment in the air. Boiling wasn't the everyday penalty. It was reserved for certain crimes that authorities thought especially vile, crimes that were not just dangerous, but polluting, like poisoning food or counterfeiting coins. Poison was terrifying in a world without science to explain it. People believed it was a tool of witches and devils, invisible, sneaky, corrupting not only the body but the soul. And so, those who used poison deserved a punishment that was equally invisible at first, but overwhelming once it began. Counterfeiters, too, were singled out because tampering with money was seen as tampering with the lifeblood of society. For these crimes, a hanging wasn't enough. The community demanded something more spectacular, something unforgettable, and boiling was the answer. The process was horrifying in its simplicity. A giant cauldron or vat would be set up in the public square, filled with water, oil, pitch, tar, or even molten lead. Fires were stoked beneath it until the liquid began to bubble, steam rising into the air, the smell acrid and choking. Then, in full view of the gathered crowd, the condemned was either dunked into the cauldron all at once or lowered gradually, inch by inch, prolonging the agony. Sometimes the person was tied on a chain and raised and lowered repeatedly, so the audience could watch the skin blister and peel, hear the screams, and see the flesh cooking like meat on a spit. Imagine standing there as the cauldron hisses and pops. The heat radiates out in waves, your eyes sting with smoke, and you can hear the bubbling grow louder. The condemned man is dragged forward, his face pale with terror, hands bound. The crowd jeers, children perched on shoulders to get a better view. Then the moment comes. The executioner signals, and a man is lowered into the boiling vat. At once, a shriek tears through the air, raw and animal, unlike anything you've ever heard. The liquid splashes as he thrashes, his skin reddening, blistering, sloughing off. The smell of burning flesh fills the square, thick and nauseating. Some people gag, others cover their mouths, but no one leaves. This is justice, and justice must be seen. The agony could last minutes, even hours, depending on how it was carried out. If the victim was submerged completely, death might come quickly, though not quickly enough to spare them the agony of boiling alive. But if they were lowered gradually, feet first, the torture stretched on. The legs would blister and blacken, the flesh literally cooking away from the bone, while the victim screamed and begged. Each inch brought a new wave of horror, until finally the chest, the arms, the face went under, and silence fell, replaced only by the bubbling of the pot. Boiling wasn't just about punishment. It was about symbolism. Just as poison corrupted secretly, boiling cleansed openly. Just as counterfeiters cooked false coins, so they themselves would be cooked in return. It was a punishment of balance, a cruel parody of justice that turned the body into an object lesson. The community gathered not only to see a criminal punished, but to reassure themselves that the order of things had been restored, that the invisible corruption had been burned away in fire and water. The English King Henry VIII famously ordered boiling to be made the official punishment for poisoners in 1531 after a particularly shocking case in which a cook tried to poison a bishop's porridge. The law declared that boiling should be done publicly, and records describe victims screaming for up to 2 hours before death finally came. It was meant to terrify, to deter anyone who thought of using poison in the shadows. And it worked. The stories spread like wildfire, carrying the image of the boiling pot from town to town, embedding it in the medieval imagination. But boiling wasn't unique to England. Variations of it appeared across Europe. In Germany, oil was sometimes used instead of water. In France, tar or molten lead. In parts of Italy, victims might be boiled in wine, turning the punishment into a grotesque parody of feasting. Even in Russia and Asia, boiling was recorded as a punishment for treason or betrayal. The method may have differed, but the spectacle was the same. A body cooking alive in front of an audience too shocked to look away. Now put yourself there. You're accused of counterfeiting coins, maybe shaving silver off the edges, maybe just passing off a bad one without knowing it. But the accusation sticks, and the penalty is boiling. You're dragged into the square, the cauldron already bubbling, the smell of smoke in your nostrils. The crowd stares, their eyes wide, their mouths twisted with anticipation or disgust. You try to plead your case, but your words vanish in the roar of the fire. The chains tighten around your arms, and suddenly you're being lowered. The first touch of boiling water is like knives, 1,000 stabs at once. You scream, thrash, kick, but the iron holds you steady. The crowd recoils at the sound, but no one helps. They just watch as your body is slowly consumed by heat, your skin blistering, bursting, sloughing off in sheets. You beg for death, but death takes its time. Minutes stretch into eternities until, finally, mercifully, you sink beneath the surface and disappear. Boiling left more than just death. It left scars on the community, memories that lingered long after the cauldron was cleaned and put away. People would whisper about the screams for years, children growing up with the image of a man cooking alive burned into their minds. It wasn't just justice. It was trauma, repeated again and again as long as the punishment was used. It's easy to wonder whether these punishments were truly about deterring crime or about feeding something darker in human nature, a hunger for spectacle, for blood, for the thrill of watching someone else suffer. Boiling, more than most, seemed designed for that purpose. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't quick, it wasn't even common. But when it was used, it was unforgettable. And that was the point. To make sure no one forgot what happened to poisoners and counterfeiters. To make sure the very thought of their crimes brought back the smell of boiling flesh, the sound of screams echoing across the square, the image of steam rising over a cauldron that wasn't cooking soup but a human life. That was execution by boiling. Justice turned into horror. Death turned into a meal for the senses, a reminder carved not into stone, but into the very air the community breathed. And after all the breaking, sawing, boiling, and spiking, you might think medieval punishments couldn't get stranger. But cruelty wasn't always about blood and screams. Sometimes humiliation itself was the weapon. And in a society where reputation was everything, humiliation could cut deeper than steel. Enter the wheelbarrow walk and the shame parade. Punishments that turned everyday life into theater, making the condemned into clumsy actors stumbling through their own disgrace. The wheelbarrow walk was exactly what it sounds like, a person forced to push or drag a heavy load through town, often barefoot, sometimes in chains, always under the gaze of neighbors. The wheelbarrow wasn't just for show, it was overloaded with stones, manure, or whatever would make the task most degrading. The condemned, already weak from imprisonment or beating, staggered along while the crowd jeered. It wasn't about breaking bones. It was about breaking spirit, turning a human being into a beast of burden in front of everyone they knew. Shame parades took it a step further. Offenders were stripped to the waist, or sometimes entirely naked, smeared with soot or ashes, and marched through the streets while townsfolk hurled insults, rotten vegetables, or even dung. Bells rang to draw more spectators. Drums beat a mocking rhythm. The condemned might wear placards around their necks describing their crime. Adulterer, thief, blasphemer. Some were forced to carry symbols of their wrongdoing. A butcher who sold rotten meat might drag a carcass. A dishonest baker might lug loaves of stone-hard bread. Every step was a reminder not only of their guilt, but of their humiliation. Imagine waking up in a small medieval town, where gossip is the blood in the streets. You've been accused of adultery, or maybe just of speaking rudely to your lord. The punishment is not execution, but shame. The guards strip you down, slap soot across your face, and hang a crude sign around your neck. Then they thrust a wheelbarrow into your hands, piled high with rocks, so heavy you can barely lift it. The drums begin, the crowd gathers, and suddenly you're stumbling forward, every neighbor watching, every child pointing, every rival smirking. Your dignity is peeled away with each clumsy step. What makes these punishments so brutal is that they don't end when the parade does. Unlike death, humiliation lingers. Tomorrow, next week, even next year, people will still remember. They'll nudge each other at the market. That's the one who pushed the dung cart. They'll whisper when you walk by, laugh when you bend to pick something up, refuse to deal with you in trade. In a world where survival depended on reputation, where being shunned could mean starvation, shame was often a punishment worse than pain. And the crowd loved it. Shame parades were public theater, more accessible than a hanging, less gruesome than a boiling, but every bit as entertaining. People laughed, sang mocking songs, threw whatever garbage they could find. Some towns even kept official masks or costumes for offenders to wear during their parade. A goat's head for lust, a wolf's mask for greed, a donkey's ears for stupidity. The punishment turned people into living symbols, caricatures of their sins. They weren't just humiliated, They were transformed into jokes, forced to act out their shame in a carnival of cruelty. Take the adulterer, for example. In many towns, both parties would be paraded together, bound face to face, sometimes made to ride backwards on a donkey while the crowd jeered. The message was clear: your private sin is now public, your intimacy turned inside out. Or the cheating merchant, forced to carry his false weights and measures through town, each step a confession of dishonesty. These weren't punishments designed to correct behavior so much as to mark people forever. Once paraded, you could never truly wash off the soot. It's worth noting that these punishments weren't always handed down by formal courts. Sometimes they were organized by the community itself, a form of mob justice that blurred the line between law and spectacle. Villagers would drag an offender from their home, strip them, and march them through the streets, the shame parade doubling as entertainment and control. It reminded everyone that the community's moral code was enforced not just by kings and priests, but by neighbors with long memories and sharper tongues than swords. Now imagine yourself in the middle of one of these parades. Your feet are bare, the cobblestones cutting into your skin. A wheelbarrow creaks in your hands, so heavy you feel your back breaking. The sign around your neck swings with each step: thief. The children laugh, pelting you with rotten cabbage. The old women hiss and spit. Men jeer, calling out insults you'll never forget. You stumble, fall, the wheelbarrow overturns, and stones scatter across the ground. The crowd roars with laughter as guards force you to pick everyone up. Hours later, when the parade finally ends, you're exhausted, humiliated, and broken. And tomorrow, when you walk through the market, every eye still sees the word thief, even though the sign is gone. The wheelbarrow walk and shame parade were effective because they struck at the heart of what mattered most in medieval life: belonging. Pain could be endured, death accepted, but exile from your community was devastating. And humiliation was a kind of living exile, a way of cutting you off without banishing you physically. You lived among your neighbors, but you were never part of them again. The punishment didn't just end your crime, it ended your place in the world. Of course, not everyone agreed with these practices. Some churchmen argued that shame punishments risked driving sinners deeper into despair rather than back toward repentance. Others worried that crowds enjoyed them too much, turning justice into cruelty for cruelty's sake. But the punishments persisted because they worked. Fear of humiliation kept people in line. And as long as communities loved a good spectacle, there was always an audience ready to watch. Think about it. No blood, no gallows, no screams, just laughter, ridicule, and the slow destruction of a person's dignity. And yet, for many, this was worse. Pain fades, death ends, but shame lingers forever. In a world built on honor, shame was the sharpest blade of all. So picture a medieval town square on a busy afternoon. The market stalls bustle with trade. The smell of bread and livestock fills the air. Suddenly, drums begin to beat, and a crowd gathers. A man staggers forward, pushing a wheelbarrow piled with manure, a sign swinging from his neck. Behind him, a woman trudges, smeared with soot, a placard reading adulteress. Laughter echoes through the streets, children dance and jeer. This isn't theater, this isn't a festival, this is punishment. And yet, for the crowd, it is both. A carnival of shame, a reminder that stepping out of line doesn't just risk your life. It risks your dignity. That was the wheelbarrow walk and the shame parade. Punishments less bloody than the wheel, less gruesome than boiling, but in some ways more lasting. Because when the bruises healed and the wheelbarrow was put away, the memory remained. And in the medieval world, that memory was as good as a sentence that never ended.